My name is Violet and I'm 28 years old. I was standing in my bridal suite adjusting my simple white dress when I heard my mother's voice through the door. She was telling someone that my wedding was pathetic, an embarrassment to our family name. My hands trembled as I smoothed down the fabric, thinking about Ryan waiting for me at the altar, and our modest but meaningful celebration we'd planned together. My mother had always been obsessed with appearances, but I never imagined she'd try to destroy my happiness on the most important day of my life. Before I share what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. If family drama stories resonate with you, please like and subscribe to hear how one wedding day exposed 20 years of lies. Growing up, my mother Margaret was everything our small Connecticut town expected from a society woman. She hosted charity galas in our colonial home, served on 3 different boards, and never missed a country club luncheon. Her dinner parties were legendary, with perfectly arranged flowers and 5-course meals that had guests talking for weeks afterward. My father Thomas, a quiet but successful accountant, would stand beside her at these events, smiling politely while she commanded the room. Appearance is everything, she'd tell me while brushing my hair before school. The world judges you in the first 30 seconds, so you must always be impeccable. I believed her for years until I realized that her version of impeccable meant suffocating. When I chose nursing school over law school, she didn't speak to me for a month. "You're throwing away your potential," she said when she finally broke her silence. "Nurses are servants, Violet. We don't serve, we lead." But I loved the work, loved helping people heal, loved the honest simplicity of caring for others without pretense. That's where I met Ryan. He was a paramedic who brought in a cardiac patient one busy night shift. While other doctors barely acknowledged the EMS crews, I always made sure to thank them. Ryan noticed. He started bringing me coffee on particularly brutal shifts, and we'd steal 5 minutes to talk about anything except work. His laugh was genuine, his stories were real, and he never once asked about my family's money or connections. For 6 months, I kept him secret. I knew what would happen when Margaret found out I was dating someone she'd consider beneath our status. Ryan understood. He came from a working-class family. His father was a mechanic, his mother cleaned offices at night. He'd worked 2 jobs to put himself through paramedic training. He was everything Margaret would hate, which made me love him more. When I finally introduced them, Margaret's smile never reached her eyes. "How interesting," she said, looking at Ryan like he was something she'd scrape off her shoe. "I didn't know they let paramedics eat at restaurants like this." Ryan handled it with grace, but I saw the hurt flash across his face. The campaign to break us up started immediately. She'd arranged surprise dinners with doctors from the hospital, lawyers, from her firm, anyone with the right pedigree. She'd accidentally forget to put Ryan's name on invitations to family events. When her friends asked about my boyfriend, she'd say I was keeping my options open. My father would pull me aside sometimes, usually in his study where Margaret never entered. "He seems like a good man," he'd say quietly. But he never stood up to her in public, never defended Ryan when Margaret made her cutting remarks. The night Ryan proposed changed everything. He took me to the state park where we'd had our first real date, timing it perfectly for sunrise. There were no photographers, no elaborate setup, just him and me and a simple diamond ring that he'd saved for months to buy. His proposal was about our future, about building something real together, about choosing love over everything else. When I showed Margaret the ring, she actually laughed. "Well, I suppose it's sweet in its own way," she said, "though you'll regret this mediocrity when you're 40 and realize what you gave up." That night, I heard her on the phone with her sister Patricia, lamenting about how I was destroying my life for someone who'd never provide properly. Planning the wedding became a battle. Margaret wanted the country club. I wanted the botanical garden where Ryan and I loved to walk. She wanted 200 guests. I wanted 50. She wanted a band. I wanted our friend who played acoustic guitar. Every decision became a fight about class and standards and what people would think. Finally exhausted from arguing, I thought we'd reached a compromise. She agreed to the garden venue and smaller guest list if she could help with some of the decorations. I should have known better. I should have seen that Margaret never compromised, she only strategized. The weeks before the wedding, she seemed almost supportive. She helped with flower selections, offered to handle the table settings, even complimented my dress choice once. Dad mentioned she was spending a lot of time in her home office with the door locked, but I was too relieved by the peace to question it. Ryan's family embraced me completely. His mother Helen taught me her secret marinara recipe. His father John showed me baby pictures of Ryan with his face covered in birthday cake. His sister Emma asked me to be in her wedding next year. They were everything Margaret's circle wasn't: warm, genuine, and completely unimpressed by money or status. I woke at 6 on my wedding morning to birds singing outside my hotel window. For a moment, everything felt perfect. Sarah, my best friend since college, was already up making coffee. Lisa, my cousin, who'd escaped Margaret's influence by moving to California, was laying out the bridesmaid dresses. Emma was texting updates from Ryan's room, assuring me he'd been banned from seeing any messages from me until the ceremony. The peace shattered when Margaret arrived at 7 with an entire glam squad I hadn't requested. The hairstylist immediately started critiquing my planned simple updo. The makeup artist pulled out enough products to paint a mural. Margaret supervised it all like a general commanding troops. Such a shame about the venue limitations, she said, while the stylist yanked my hair into submission. If we'd chosen the country club, we could have had the grand staircase entrance. I reminded her that I didn't want a grand entrance, just a meaningful ceremony. She patted my shoulder with that condescending smile I'd grown to hate. Your father's friends will be so disappointed, she continued watching the makeup artist work. The Weatherbys were expecting something more substantial. They've known you since you were 3. I bit my tongue, remembering that the Weatherbys had never once remembered my birthday or asked about my life beyond what college I'd attended. At least the photographer will know how to minimize the budget decorations, she added, and that's when Sarah shot me a warning look. I hadn't hired a photographer beyond my friend Mark, who did weddings on weekends. Margaret noticed our exchange and waved her hand dismissively. Don't worry, I hired someone professional. We can't have iPhone photos of such an important day. Dad arrived at 9, looking uncomfortable in his tux. He pulled me aside while Margaret was berating the makeup artist about my lipstick shade. Something's bothering me about your mother, he said quietly. She's been having secret phone calls, locking her office, moving money around. There are charges on the credit cards I don't recognize. I told him it was probably just wedding expenses, that Margaret always got dramatic about big events. He shook his head. This is different, Violet. She's planning something. But before he could explain more, Margaret swept back in criticizing his boutonniere placement. I escaped to the bathroom and heard Margaret on her phone in the hallway. Everything must be perfect today, she was saying. No one can know until after. I've worked too hard for this to fall apart now. The ceremony starts at 2, and by tonight everything will be secured. When I confronted her, she smiled that fake smile she used at charity events. Just coordinating with the vendors, darling. You really should be focusing on your breathing exercises. You look flushed. Sarah found me crying in the bathroom 10 minutes later, mascara running down my cheeks. That's when Sarah told me what she'd discovered. While I was getting dressed, she'd gone to check on the venue setup. Margaret had changed everything. My wildflower arrangements were replaced with massive white orchids. The simple wooden arch Ryan's father built was hidden behind an elaborate fabric monstrosity. The handwritten place cards I'd spent weeks on were gone, replaced with engraved ones listing everyone's titles and achievements. I wanted to run to the venue immediately, but Margaret had timed everything perfectly. The photographers she'd hired were waiting, the car was scheduled, and guests were already arriving. I had no choice but to move forward. When we arrived at the garden, I barely recognized it. My vision of natural beauty had been transformed into Margaret's idea of elegance. White and gold, everything chairs with enormous bows, a red carpet runner that looked absolutely ridiculous on the grass. Ryan's family stood in a cluster near the back, looking as out of place as I felt. Margaret was already working the crowd, air-kissing her society friends, pointing out details like she was giving a tour. I heard her tell someone that she'd had to salvage what she could from Violet's simple plans. Dad stood near the bar, drinking what looked like his 3rd scotch before noon. The photographer Margaret hired kept positioning me for staged shots that felt nothing like me. Chin up, shoulders back, don't smile so much, it creates wrinkles. I wanted to scream that this was my wedding, not a fashion shoot, but the guests were watching and the ceremony was starting soon. Ryan's parents found me during a break in photos. Helen hugged me tight and whispered, "Don't let her win, honey. Ryan loves you, not all this nonsense." John added, "That boy's been pacing since dawn, just wanting to marry you. None of this matters except that." As the music started and I prepared to walk down the aisle, Dad took my arm. His hand was shaking slightly. "Just be yourself," he said. "That's all that matters today." But I could see in his eyes that he knew something I didn't, some storm that was coming that even he couldn't prevent. The walk down that aisle felt like a mile. Margaret had positioned herself in the front row, wearing a dress that looked suspiciously like a wedding gown in ivory. She was already dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, though I knew there were no real tears. Her society friends filled the first 3 rows on our side, while Ryan's family and our actual friends were scattered behind them. But then I saw Ryan and everything else faded. He was standing at the altar in the simple navy suit we'd picked out together, his eyes bright with unshed tears, his smile genuine and warm. His best man, Pete, gave me a thumbs up and I almost laughed. This was what mattered, not Margaret's circus. As the officiant began, I heard Margaret stage whisper to Mrs. Weatherby. Such simple vows, she said loud enough for the first 5 rows to hear. No poetry, no Shakespeare. I suppose that's what happens when you rush things. Ryan's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on mine. When I said my vows, promising to love Ryan through whatever came, Margaret sighed audibly. That dress would look so much better on someone taller, she told someone behind her. And those shoes, well, comfort over style, I suppose. I gripped Ryan's hands tighter, drawing strength from his steady presence. The moment Ryan began his vows, speaking about how I'd shown him that love meant accepting someone completely, Margaret whispered again. The flowers are already wilting. I told her to order roses, but she insisted on these wildflowers. So unprofessional. I saw Helen turn around and glare at Margaret, but my mother was immune to disapproval from people she considered beneath her. When we exchanged rings, Ryan's hands were steady while mine shook. Margaret's commentary continued. Those rings will need upgrading eventually. No one wears simple bands anymore. It's practically vintage and not in a good way. The officiant had to raise his voice to be heard over her whispers. Finally, Ryan and I kissed, and for that moment, it was just us. The garden, the guests, even Margaret disappeared. But as we turned to face everyone, as husband and wife, Margaret was already standing, moving toward the microphone at the reception area. Before we could even make it back down the aisle, she was talking. Ladies and gentlemen, the mother of the bride traditionally waits to speak, but I simply must share my thoughts while emotions are high. Ryan and I exchanged glances. This wasn't part of the plan. We stood at the back of the aisle as Margaret commanded the space. Despite the modest circumstances, she began, and I felt Ryan's hand tighten around mine. I'm proud that my daughter has chosen to follow her heart, even if it led her away from the path I'd dreamed for her. This isn't what I envisioned for my only child, of course. I'd imagined something grander, someone more established, a future, more secure. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Ryan's mother's face was turning red. Dad was signaling Margaret to stop, but she was in full performance mode. Sometimes we must accept disappointment and find grace in simplicity. Not everyone can achieve the highest standards, and that's okay. Violet has chosen love over logic, passion over prudence. We can only hope it sustains them when reality sets in. By the time she finished, the atmosphere was poisoned. Ryan's parents looked devastated. His mother Helen excused herself, and I saw her heading toward the bathroom. I started to follow, but Margaret intercepted me. Darling, we need photos with the important guests first. The Weatherbys have to leave early for another engagement. I found Helen crying in the bathroom 5 minutes later. She'd locked herself in a stall, and I could hear her trying to muffle her sobs. Helen, please, I said through the door. She doesn't speak for me. You know that. She finally came out, her face streaked with tears. She called us trash, Helen said. Before the ceremony, when she didn't know I was behind her, she told someone that her daughter was marrying into trash, and she'd never live it down. That you were throwing your life away on my son. I held Helen while she cried, my own anger building into something volcanic. Sarah found us there, and her face was grim. You need to get back out there, she said. Your mother's now critiquing the catering to the staff, and Ryan's about to lose it. The reception was already in full disaster mode. Margaret had the microphone again, interrupting Pete's best man speech to correct his pronunciation of our venue's name. The catering staff looked miserable as she followed them around, pointing out everything from the temperature of the soup to the arrangement of the appetizers. During the father-daughter dance, Dad held me close and whispered, I'm sorry, over and over. For what I asked, but he just shook his head. You'll understand soon, he said. Just remember, I love you no matter what happens next. Margaret cut in halfway through the song, lecturing me about my posture while we danced. You're slouching, dear. All those years of dance lessons wasted. The photographer will have to work miracles with these shots. I counted to 10 in my head, then 20, then gave up and just tried to survive until the song ended. That's when I snapped. I walked to the DJ booth and asked for the microphone. The room went quiet as I stood there looking at all these people, some who loved us, some who were just there for the show. I want to talk about what real family means. I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Real family doesn't need designer flowers or perfect place settings. Real family shows up with casseroles when you're sick, celebrates your victories without jealousy, and loves you without conditions. Margaret stood up from her table, her face shifting from surprise to fury. She stalked toward me, and before I could stop her, she yanked the microphone from my hands. Don't embarrass yourself more than you already have, she hissed, then turned to address the room. My daughter is emotional, understandably. Weddings can be overwhelming when you're not prepared for the attention. But in her haste to take control, she made a mistake. She said something she hadn't meant to say, something that changed everything. Once the investigation is over, she began, then froze, her face going white as she realized what she'd revealed. The silence in that garden was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Dad stood up slowly from his chair, his face a mask of controlled fury I'd never seen before. "What investigation, Margaret?" His voice carried across the space like thunder. Margaret's hands shook as she lowered the microphone. "This isn't the time, Thomas. We have guests." But the guests were all leaning forward now, and several had their phones out recording everything. I took the microphone back from her unresisting fingers. "No, Mum, I think this is exactly the time. What investigation are you talking about?" She tried to move toward the exit, but Pete and 2 other groomsmen casually blocked her path. They weren't threatening, just present, and Margaret was trapped by her own need to maintain appearances. Uncle Robert, Dad's brother, who worked as a lawyer, stepped forward. "I think I can shed some light on this," he said, his voice carrying the authority of years in courtrooms. "I've been suspicious about Margaret's charity foundation for months. Some irregularities in the public filings caught my attention." Margaret spun toward him, her composure cracking. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under. The expectations, the standards I have to maintain. None of you understand what it takes to keep this family respectable." The unraveling happened fast after that. Like a designer sweater with one pulled thread, everything came apart. Robert had done his research. The charity Margaret ran, supposedly for underprivileged children, had some interesting expenses. Designer clothing, luxury spa retreats, first-class travel to resorts that had nothing to do with charity work. $500,000, Robert said, and gasps echoed through the garden. At least that's what's missing from the last 3 years of fundraising. The country club galas, the benefit dinners, the silent auctions, most of that money never made it to any children. Dad collapsed into his chair. The colour drained from his face as the pieces clicked together. "The second mortgage," he said quietly. "You said it was for renovating the house." Margaret's face crumpled. She'd been caught and everyone was watching. The house renovation that never happened. The investment opportunity that didn't exist. Even the country club membership was months behind in dues, with Margaret scrambling to pay just enough to keep them from posting her name on the delinquent list. "I did it for this family," she screamed, mascara running down her face in black streams. "Do you know what they say about us? About how Thomas is just an accountant, not a partner. About how our daughter became a nurse instead of a doctor. About how we drive cars more than 3 years old." The irony was staggering. She'd stolen money meant for actually needy children to maintain an image of wealth we didn't have. And she'd chosen my wedding day to maintain that image one last time before everything collapsed. "You needed the perfect wedding," I said, understanding flooding through me. "You needed these people to see us as successful before they found out about the investigation. This whole show wasn't about my marriage. It was about your last performance." Margaret's society friends were already leaving, whispering among themselves, clutching their pearls and heading for their luxury cars. Mrs. Weatherby walked past Margaret without a word, which in their circle was worse than a slap. But Ryan's family stayed. Helen came to stand beside me, John flanked Ryan, and Emma started helping the catering staff clean up the overturned flower arrangements from Margaret's dramatic gestures. This was real family choosing to stay when things got ugly. The breakdown was complete when Margaret turned on everyone. She blamed Dad for not earning more, for being content with his quiet success. She blamed me for not marrying someone wealthy, for choosing love over financial security. She blamed society for having standards she couldn't meet honestly. "You're all hypocrites," she screamed at the remaining guests. "You pretend money doesn't matter, but it's all that matters. Every single one of you would have done the same thing to protect your reputation." That's when Ryan spoke up. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice he used with panicked patience. "No, Margaret, we wouldn't have, because reputation built on lies isn't worth protecting. My parents worked honest jobs their whole lives. They may not have country club memberships, but they sleep peacefully, knowing they've never stolen from children." Margaret lunged at him, then actually tried to strike my new husband. But the security guards, Ryan's cop friends had become for the day, stepped in. They restrained her, gently but firmly, and the sight of Margaret being held back by security at the wedding she'd tried to hijack was both tragic and deeply satisfying. Her final words before they escorted her to her car were directed at me. "You've ruined everything. 20 years of building our position, our reputation, our standing, and you destroyed it all for him. I hope you're satisfied with your ordinary little life." as she was led away still ranting about ingratitude and sacrifice. Someone started clapping. It was Helen Ryan's mother, and soon others joined in, not applauding Margaret's exit, but supporting us, the newlyweds, who'd just had their wedding turned into a crime scene. Robert approached with Margaret's phone, which had fallen from her purse in the struggle. "You might want to see this," he said quietly. The emails were all there, years of correspondence about hiding money, falsifying charity documents, and worse affairs with powerful men in exchange for keeping quiet about her debts. The country club president, the mayor's aide, even the head of another charity. She'd been trading favours and secrets for years, building a house of cards that was always destined to collapse. And she'd chosen my wedding as her last grand performance before it all came tumbling down. The rest of the reception was surreal. With Margaret gone, the artificial atmosphere evaporated. The remaining guests helped us tear down her elaborate decorations, revealing the simple beauty we'd originally planned. Sarah found our original playlist, and soon David Bowie was playing instead of classical music. The caterers, freed from Margaret's criticism, brought out the comfort food we'd originally ordered, not the pretentious menu she'd forced on them. Dad gave a speech that was nothing like the one he'd prepared. He talked about prison bars we build for ourselves, about the difference between looking successful and being happy. He apologised for the years of enabling Margaret's behaviour, for choosing peace over truth. When he toasted to our future, his eyes were clear for the first time I could remember. Helen stood up next, still in her simple dress that Margaret had mocked earlier. She talked about raising Ryan to value honesty over appearance work, over wealth and love, over everything else. "When someone shows you their true self," she said, looking directly at where Margaret had stood, "believe them the first time." The dancing that followed was real. Ryan's father taught my cousins to two-step. Sarah's girlfriend spun her around to Motown hits. Even Dad loosened his tie and attempted the electric slide. It was the wedding we'd wanted all along, just with a dramatic intermission we'd never forget. Around sunset, Uncle Robert pulled us aside for a legal reality check. Criminal charges would definitely be filed. The charity fraud alone would mean serious jail time, and the forged mortgage documents added federal charges. Margaret had been living on borrowed time, and she'd known it. Dad made his decision right there in the garden. He'd file for divorce immediately and cooperate fully with the investigation. The house would have to be sold to pay back the stolen funds. His reputation would take a hit, but he said he'd rather be honestly broke than falsely rich. The wedding gifts told their own story. Margaret's society friends had mostly given checks, which they'd stopped payment on before leaving. But Ryan's family and our real friends had given handmade gifts, photo albums, and promises of help with our new apartment. The contrast was perfect. When we cut the cake, a simple 3-tier creation that Margaret had called pedestrian, Sarah made a toast. To Violet and Ryan, she said, who got the wedding crasher from hell and still managed to have a perfect day. Because perfection isn't about flowers or fancy venues, it's about marrying the right person surrounded by people who actually give a damn about you. Ryan's speech was beautiful in its simplicity. He thanked his parents for showing him that wealth had nothing to do with worth. He thanked my father for having the courage to finally break free. And he thanked Margaret, which shocked everyone, for showing us all exactly what not to become. As we prepared to leave for our honeymoon, Margaret made one last appearance. She'd returned with the police, claiming we'd stolen her decorations and demanding their return. The officers, who'd already been briefed by Robert about the situation, told her to leave or face trespassing charges. She stood in the parking lot as we got into Ryan's dependable Toyota, decorated with cans and silly string by his paramedic crew. "This isn't over," she called out. "I'll fight this. You'll see that everything I did was for this family." Dad approached her one last time. "No, Margaret, everything you did was for yourself, for an image that was never real. We could have been happy with less, but you couldn't. And now you've lost everything that actually mattered." As we drove away, I looked back to see her standing alone in that parking lot, her ivory dress wrinkled, her perfect makeup destroyed, her empire in ruins. I waited to feel sympathy, but all I felt was relief. The prison she'd built for all of us had finally been demolished. Our honeymoon was supposed to be a quiet week at a cabin in Vermont, but the news travelled fast. Margaret's arrest made the local papers. Socialite charged with charity fraud. The federal investigation revealed she'd been stealing for nearly 2 decades, starting small and growing bolder as she got away with it. Messages poured in from wedding guests. Some expressed shock. Others admitted they'd always suspected something was off about Margaret's perfect facade. The elderly donors she'd scammed started coming forward with their stories, and each one broke my heart a little more. Ryan held me while I processed it all. His family called daily not to gossip but to check on us. Helen sent care packages to our hotel. John offered to help Dad move. Emma started a meal train for when we got home. This was what family really looked like. When we returned from Vermont, our small apartment felt like a sanctuary. No marble countertops or designer furniture, just our combined belongings and the freedom to be ourselves. Dad had moved in temporarily, sleeping on our couch while the divorce proceedings started. Watching him learn to cook basic meals and laugh at Ryan's terrible jokes was like meeting my father for the first time. The prosecution contacted me immediately. They needed my testimony about Margaret's pattern of deception, the way she'd manipulated everyone around her for decades. Going through the evidence was devastating. She'd kept detailed journals, and her contempt for everyone, including me, dripped from every page. One entry from my college graduation read, "Violet insists on this nursing nonsense. All that money on private school wasted." She could have married the Pemberton boy and secured our future, but she chooses poverty. The disappointment is suffocating. Reading my mother's real thoughts about me should have hurt more, but it was actually liberating. I'd spent years trying to earn approval that was never possible. The investigation revealed that Margaret had stolen from at least 15 different charities over 20 years. She'd used her position and reputation to access funds meant for homeless shelters, literacy programs, and after-school care. The total was close to $2 million spent on maintaining an illusion of wealth we'd never actually had. Dad discovered debt everywhere. Credit cards he didn't know existed, loans taken out in his name, even a third mortgage attempt that had been denied just weeks before the wedding. Margaret had been desperately trying to secure one last influx of cash, probably to run. The wedding had been her attempt to save face before disappearing. Work became my refuge. My colleagues at the hospital were incredibly supportive, never prying but always available. My patients dealing with real problems like cancer and heart disease gave me perspective. Their battles were real. Margaret's were all self-inflicted. Ryan's partner at the ambulance company joked that our wedding video should be training material for handling dramatic scenes. But Ryan never made light of my pain. He held me when I cried about the mother I'd never really had celebrated with me, when I set new boundaries, and reminded me daily that Margaret's crimes weren't my fault. Patricia, Margaret's sister, called once. She tried to guilt me about family loyalty, about how Margaret had always been under such pressure to succeed. I told her that Margaret chose crime over contentment, that she'd had countless opportunities to choose differently. Patricia hung up when I suggested she look into her own charities books, knowing Margaret had helped run that one too. The preliminary hearing was brutal. Seeing Margaret in orange jumpsuit, her hair flat without professional styling, her face aged without expensive treatments, she looked like a stranger. But her attitude hadn't changed. She sat there glaring at everyone like we'd betrayed her, like she was the victim. Her lawyer tried to argue that Margaret had been maintaining social standards, that the pressure of keeping up appearances in their social circle had driven her to desperate measures. The judge, a woman who'd worked her way through law school as a single mother, was not impressed. When bail was discussed, the prosecution presented evidence that Margaret had been planning to flee. Tickets to the Caymans purchased with stolen funds, hidden bank accounts, even a fake passport in progress. Bail was denied. Margaret would await trial from jail, her worst nightmare of public humiliation fully realised. The trial itself took 3 months. I testified for 2 days, detailing the lifetime of manipulation and emotional abuse disguised as maternal concern. Ryan testified about the wedding, how Margaret had tried to humiliate his family. Dad's testimony was the most devastating, revealing how Margaret had isolated him from friends, controlled their finances without his knowledge, and threatened suicide whenever he questioned her spending. The verdict was guilty on all counts. 5 to 15 years in federal prison, plus restitution to all the charities she'd robbed. Margaret's reaction was predictable. She screamed about injustice, about how she'd sacrificed everything for her ungrateful family, about how we'd all regret this when we were living in poverty without her connections. As they led her away, she looked at me one last time. "I raised you better than this," she said. I looked her straight in the eye and replied, "No, you didn't, but I raised myself better despite you." Patricia visited her exactly once. She came to our apartment afterwards shaken. Margaret had spent the entire visit criticising Patricia's outfit, weight, and life choices. Even in prison, she couldn't stop performing superiority. Patricia apologised for defending her and promised to check her own charities books. She found irregularities immediately. 6 months after the wedding, life had found a new rhythm. Dad moved into a modest apartment downtown close to his office and within walking distance of a coffee shop where he'd become a regular. He'd started dating Helen's friend from book club, a retired teacher named Susan, who made him laugh and didn't care that he drove a 10-year-old Honda. Dad's transformation was remarkable. He joined a hiking club, learnt to make Thai food, and started therapy to understand how he'd spent 20 years controlled by a narcissist. He apologized to me constantly at first, until I told him that his freedom was apology enough. Ryan and I settled into married life without drama or pretense. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, Sunday dinners with his family, quiet evenings reading together on our second-hand couch. It was everything Margaret would have called mediocre, and it was absolutely perfect. My promotion to ICU supervisor came through with a substantial raise that meant we could start saving for a house. A real house we'd choose and pay for honestly, not a monument to false success. Ryan's captain recommended him for paramedic trainer position, recognizing his ability to stay calm in chaos, a skill certainly tested at our wedding. The wedding video did go viral though, not how anyone expected. Someone had posted it online with the title, "Mother of Bride Exposed as Fraud at Wedding," and it gained 3 million views in a week. The comments ranged from sympathy to shock to people sharing their own toxic family stories. We became accidental advocates for cutting off abusive family members. Speaking invitations started coming in. Support groups for children of narcissistic parents, charity organizations wanting to hear about red flags for fraud, even a true crime podcast. We declined most of them, but accepted a few that felt meaningful, especially ones that might help others recognize manipulation disguised as love. The deepest lesson from all of this wasn't about Margaret's crimes or the money she stole. It was about the prisons we build for ourselves when we accept that appearance matters more than authenticity. Every fake smile at those charity galas, every lie about being happy, every moment of choosing peace over truth had been another bar in that cage. Margaret had taught me that love was conditional based on achievement and appearance. Ryan's family taught me that love was showing up with casseroles and bad jokes and genuine presence. Dad learned that conflict avoidance was just slow-motion destruction. I learned that disappointing someone who only loves an idea of you isn't really disappointment at all. On our first anniversary, we renewed our vows in our apartment's small backyard. 10 people attended Dad and Susan Ryan's parents and sister Sarah, and her girlfriend Uncle Robert, and our neighbours who'd become friends. Dad officiated, having gotten ordained online. His speech was about freedom and forgiveness, about the courage to start over at any age. Margaret sent a letter from prison that week. I recognised her handwriting on the envelope. Without opening it, I added it to the box of other unopened letters she'd sent. Maybe someday I'd read them, but not yet. Probably not ever. Some words don't deserve an audience. Dad asked if I wanted to know what she wrote in her letters to him. I didn't. He'd stopped opening them too after the first one contained nothing but blame and manipulation. She hadn't learned anything hadn't changed, was still performing for an audience that no longer existed. The money from selling my parents' house went entirely to restitution. Dad moved through it with grace, saying he'd rather own nothing honestly than everything falsely. The charity recipients were grateful, some even forgiving. One elderly woman whose donation had been stolen hugged Dad and said, "You're not responsible for her choices, dear. You're just another one of her victims." Ryan's mother Helen became the mother I'd always needed. She taught me to knit badly to make pie crust from scratch, to understand that family was about choice, not blood. When I thanked her once for accepting me so completely, she laughed. "Honey, you saved my son from some society princess who would have made him miserable. I should be thanking you. People sometimes ask if I forgive Margaret." The truth is, forgiveness isn't the point. I understand her now, the desperate need for external validation, the hollow core she tried to fill with other people's money and approval. But understanding doesn't mean accepting. Some people are better loved from a distance, and some people are better not loved at all. The most surprising outcome was how many people reached out with their own stories. Co-workers who'd hidden family dysfunction, friends who'd cut off toxic parents, strangers who'd survived similar betrayals. Margaret's dramatic explosion had given others permission to speak their truth. Some say your wedding day changes your life, and mine certainly did, just not how anyone expected. Margaret called it an embarrassment, but it became my Independence Day. Every anniversary, we don't just celebrate our marriage. We celebrate the moment truth crashed the party and set us all free. We celebrate the death of pretense and the birth of authenticity. We celebrate choosing love over logic, as Margaret said, but finding that love is the only logic that matters. The terrifying thing everyone saw wasn't just Margaret's crimes. It was how long we'd all participated in the lie, how many years we'd wasted protecting an image that was destroying us from the inside. But mostly it was terrifying to realize how much better life could be when you stop performing and start living. Ryan and I sometimes drive past the botanical garden where we got married. The owners told us our wedding was the most memorable they'd ever hosted, though they kindly didn't elaborate. We laugh about it now, how Margaret's need for a perfect finale gave us the most imperfect perfect day of our lives. Last week, I got a call from the federal prison. Margaret had listed me as her emergency contact, and they needed to inform me she'd been hospitalized. A mild heart issue, nothing serious. I updated them with Patricia's contact information and asked to be removed from her file. The administrator said she understood completely that it was more common than I'd think. I felt nothing when I hung up. Not satisfaction, not sadness, just peace. Margaret was facing the consequences of her choices, and I was living the life she'd tried to prevent. A simple, honest, loving life that she would still call mediocre, and I call magnificent. Ryan found me staring out the window after that call. He didn't ask questions, just held me and reminded me that we had dinner with his parents that night. Helen was making her famous lasagna, John would tell terrible dad jokes, Emma would update us on her own wedding planning, and we'd all be genuinely happy to be together. No performance, no judgment, just family. This is our life now, small and real and ours. Margaret stole money meant for children, but she also stole years of authentic living from everyone around her. We can't get those years back, but we can make sure the remaining ones count. We can choose truth over appearance, love over status, and freedom over the prison of other people's opinions. Some would say Margaret got what she deserved, but I don't think about deserve anymore. We all get what we choose eventually. Margaret chose lies and got isolation. Dad chose courage and got freedom. I chose love and got a life worth living. The image Margaret protected so fiercely for years wasn't just destroyed that day, it was revealed to have never existed at all. And in its ruins, something real could finally grow. If you've ever dealt with a toxic family member who put appearances over authenticity, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. How did you break free from their performance? When did you choose your own happiness over their approval? Please like this video if it resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about choosing truth over pretense, and share this with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to stop performing for people who only love your costume. Thank you for listening to my story. Remember, the most embarrassing thing isn't living simply, it's living a lie. And the most terrifying thing isn't being exposed, it's never being free.